The cage in Fallow Ridge's town square held more than just a man. It contained the town's cruelty, made manifest where children threw stones for sport and adults paid coins to touch the beast. But when Widow Selma saw the watchful eyes behind those makeshift bars, she recognized something the townsfolk had missed entirely. Selma clutched her late husband's wedding ring, the last precious thing she owned, as she studied the silent prisoner who sat motionless despite the rocks and jeers. His torn shirt and makeshift cuffs couldn't hide the dignity in his stillness, the intelligence in his gaze, or the profound sadness that matched her own recent loss. What began as an impulsive act of mercy trading gold for a man's freedom would bloom into a love story carved from silence and built through small gestures. Through wordless understanding and patient healing, Selma and Solon would discover that sometimes the deepest connections are forged without speaking a single word. Colorado Territory, 1883. Fallow Ridge squatted in the shadow of the Rockies like a scab on the landscape where frontier justice meant whatever the loudest voices decided it meant. The town survived on mining claims and cattle drives, attracting the kind of men who measured worth in gold dust and settled disputes with fists rather than words. In this harsh environment, anyone different, whether by choice or circumstance, became entertainment for people whose lives offered little other diversion. The cage in the town square wasn't just punishment, but spectacle, a reminder that civilization here was thin veneer over cruelty that found acceptable targets for its expression. For a woman traveling alone, especially a widow, without male protection, such towns represented both necessary stops and constant danger, where help was scarce and exploitation was common. Selma's widowhood was still fresh enough to ache with every breath, the loss of her husband James 6 months earlier having stripped away not just companionship, but her entire sense of place in the world. His military pension had provided enough money for a wagon and supplies to reach the homestead he'd claimed before his death, but not enough for the luxury of grief or the safety of staying put. The wedding ring she wore represented the last tangible connection to a love that had defined her adult life, making its sacrifice both devastating and somehow necessary for reasons she couldn't fully articulate. At 31, Selma possessed the practical skills necessary for frontier survival cooking, mending, basic medical care, but lacked the hardness that widowhood was supposed to teach women in her circumstances. Her inability to ignore suffering, whether in animals or people, had always been both strength and weakness. The broken wagon wheel that stranded her in Fallow Ridge was just the latest in a series of misfortunes that had tested her resolve to reach the homestead James had dreamed of claiming for their future. Her solitary journey represented both flight from memories and pilgrimage toward dreams that death had interrupted. Beneath Selma's practical exterior lay uncommon empathy that made her vulnerable to others' pain, while giving her strength to act when action seemed hopeless. Her greatest asset was the ability to see humanity where others saw only problems or threats, whether in caged prisoners or wild animals that others considered dangerous. Her deepest weakness was the tendency to give away pieces of herself to help others, sometimes at cost to her own welfare and security. Years of marriage to a gentle man had taught her that kindness was strength rather than weakness, but widowhood was testing whether that lesson could survive without his support. The cage forced Selma to choose between practical self-preservation and moral obligation, between holding on to her last connection to her husband and extending mercy to someone who reminded her of everything she'd learned about injustice. The unnamed man's imprisonment represented everything wrong with frontier justice punishment: without proof, entertainment derived from suffering, and the reduction of human beings to objects of curiosity or fear. The real conflict lay not in rescuing him from the cage, but in what came after two damaged people learning to trust each other despite carrying wounds that had made them wary of human connection. Their journey would test whether love could grow from wordless understanding, whether healing could occur through patient presence rather than passionate declaration, and whether two people who'd learned to survive alone could choose to build something together. But buying his freedom with her wedding ring was only the beginning. A man who'd forgotten how to speak and a woman who'd lost her reason for speaking would need to discover whether silence could become its own language of love. Selma's decision to trade her wedding ring for the caged man's freedom surprised everyone, including herself. The gold band had been worn smooth by years of marriage, polished by daily gestures of love and partnership that death had ended, but memory preserved. Removing it felt like final betrayal of James's devotion, yet something about the prisoner's watchful eyes made keeping it seem like betrayal of different principles her husband had taught her. "This ring should buy him," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was sacrificing. The sheriff's crude assessment of its value enough to make a story, but little more couldn't diminish the real price she was paying her last physical connection to the life she'd lost. When she offered the unnamed man choice rather than ownership, "You can come or stay, you're not anyone's anymore," she established the foundation for everything that would follow. His slow rise from the cage floor, his careful exit, and his silent presence beside her wagon spoke of someone who'd forgotten what freedom felt like, but was willing to relearn it in her company. The journey that began with her wagon wheels turning away from Fallow Ridge carried more than two broken people seeking healing. It carried the possibility that wordless understanding might prove stronger than passionate declarations, that patience might create deeper bonds than possession ever could. The first 3 days of travel revealed both the depth of their mutual damage and their remarkable capacity for unspoken cooperation. The man, still nameless, still silent, moved through camp chores with efficiency that spoke of long practice in making himself useful without drawing attention. His ability to anticipate needs, repair what was broken, and create comfort from sparse resources demonstrated skills that went far beyond mere survival. Selma found herself watching him work, noting the gentleness with which he handled her belongings, the care he took not to startle her with sudden movements, and the way he positioned himself to provide security without creating the sense of being watched or guarded. His silence wasn't sullen or defensive, but respectful, as if he understood that words could wound as easily as they could heal. Their evening routines developed naturally. She prepared food while he tended the wagon and horses. They ate in comfortable quiet, and she watched him carve small figures from scraps of wood while stars emerged overhead. His artistic skill revealed through these casual creations suggested depths of character that imprisonment had hidden but not destroyed. The practical arrangements of their shared journey, sleeping on opposite sides of the fire, working together without need for detailed instructions, Sharing resources without negotiation created intimacy based on trust rather than proximity, cooperation rather than romance. They were learning each other's rhythms without requiring explanations or promises about what their partnership might become. The breakthrough came when Selma asked directly whether he had a name, whether he could speak, and received his honest responses, head shake, then careful nod. His silence was choice rather than inability, withdrawal rather than damage. Though she sensed both wounds and wisdom behind his decision to let others fill spaces he left empty. "I'm not looking for anything from you," she told him, her words carrying weight of understanding that went beyond immediate circumstances. "I bought you because nobody deserves that cage, but I'm not buying anything else. You don't owe me." His response, tearing bread in half and offering her the larger piece, spoke louder than any verbal gratitude could have. The gesture was both practical and symbolic, sharing sustenance, acknowledging partnership, demonstrating that generosity could flow both directions even when one person seemed to hold all the power. The wolf carving he made explained through gestures as representing her rather than himself, revealed his growing understanding of her character, stubborn, independent, protective of things worth protecting. When she tied her empty ring pouch to the fire's edge, she was acknowledging their shared state of being unclaimed, free to choose rather than bound by others' expectations. But freedom was just the beginning of their story. Two people who'd learned to survive alone would now discover whether they could learn to live together, building trust from silence and love from the smallest gestures of care. The first challenge was learning to interpret each other's needs and boundaries without the usual tools of verbal communication. Selma's questions about his past, met with careful drawings of cabin flame and body-revealed trauma that had cost him not just his voice, but his family. His patient braiding of her hair became ritual that spoke of tenderness, protection, and the desire to create beauty from what remained after loss. Their wordless conversations around the evening fire developed its own grammar of gesture expression and shared understanding that transcended the limitations of spoken language while creating intimacy neither had expected to find again. His revelation of his chosen name, Solon meaning earthlight, marked crucial turning point, where silence gave way to identity, where the unnamed prisoner became someone willing to be known and called by something of his own choosing. The carved figures he made of them sitting together represented hope that their temporary partnership might become permanent choice, but also created pressure about what their relationship was becoming. Selma's offer of freedom rather than obligation tested whether his presence was gratitude, affection, or genuine desire to build something together. His response, reweaving her braid with carved bark bead bearing his name, answered without words, reaching the homestead, forced confrontation with the future they were building and the past they carried. The dilapidated cabin represented both James's unfulfilled dreams and the possibility of new beginnings created from different materials. Solon's gift of the tarnished ring that belonged to someone who died revealed the depth of his own loss while creating parallel between their griefs. His explanation that losing his voice coincided with losing someone precious suggested trauma that went beyond physical damage to encompass psychological wounds that silence had become method of honoring. Their shared commitment to making the cabin ours transformed individual survival into collective thriving. The isolation of their homestead, while providing privacy for their unconventional relationship to develop, also created vulnerability to the harsh realities of frontier life that could overwhelm two people still healing from profound losses. Winter's approach demanded preparation that tested their ability to work together under pressure while managing resources that might prove inadequate for their survival. The legal complications of their situation, a woman traveling with a man of unknown background who'd been imprisoned for suspected crimes, created potential problems if territorial authorities decided to investigate their circumstances. Solon's lack of legal identity meant he existed in bureaucratic limbo that could be resolved either through official recognition or official persecution. Social isolation, while protecting them from judgment about their unusual partnership, also meant they lacked community support systems that frontier families typically relied upon for assistance during emergencies, medical crises, or seasonal challenges that exceeded individual capabilities. Most significantly, their emotional healing occurred without external validation or guidance, creating risk that their mutual dependence might become unhealthy codependence rather than genuine partnership built on individual strength and autonomous choice. Under mounting challenges, both Selma and Solon discovered capabilities they hadn't known they possessed. Selma's evolution from grieving widow following her husband's dreams to confident homesteader creating her own vision required learning to make decisions based on present reality rather than past promises. Her growing comfort with Solon's presence, her willingness to accept his gifts and gestures, and her decision to stay rather than continue traveling, marked her transformation from someone fleeing memories to someone building new ones. Solon's emergence from traumatic silence into chosen communication demonstrated healing that went beyond recovering his voice to encompass reclaiming his identity and agency. His artistic expressions, carvings, drawings, braided designs revealed creativity that imprisonment had suppressed but not destroyed. His willingness to share his story through images, to offer gifts that carried personal meaning, and to commit to shared future showed evolution from surviving alone to choosing partnership. Their relationship deepened beyond mutual aid into genuine collaboration where each contributed unique strengths to their shared goals. Selma's practical skills and legal status, combined with Solon's craftsmanship and intuitive understanding of her needs, created household that functioned efficiently while honoring both their individual healing and their growing connection. The approaching winter created urgency about completing preparations that would determine their survival, while Solon's mysterious past threatened to surface in ways that could disrupt the peaceful life they were building. His artistic skill and obvious education suggested background that didn't match his imprisonment, raising questions about what had really happened and whether danger might follow them to their remote homestead. The emotional intensity of their wordless relationship, while beautiful in its unique intimacy, also created pressure that neither fully understood how to navigate. Their mutual attraction was evident, but the boundaries of their partnership remained undefined in ways that could lead to misunderstanding or disappointment. Selma's continuing grief for James, symbolized by her acceptance of Solon's ring while still mourning her wedding band, created complex emotional terrain where past love and present affection existed simultaneously without clear resolution about what their relationship meant or what it might become. Most ominously, their isolation meant that if either suffered accident, illness, or psychological crisis, the other would face impossible choices about seeking help that might expose Solon to authorities or attempting to manage alone with potentially fatal consequences. As winter approached and their bond deepened, Selma and Solon faced their greatest test not from external threats, but from the internal challenge of transforming wordless understanding into lasting love strong enough to survive whatever storms might come. The crisis came not with violence or external threat, but with internal collapse that threatened everything they'd built together. 3 months into winter, as supplies ran lower and isolation pressed harder, Selma woke to find Solon gone, not hunting as his note claimed, but truly vanished, his few belongings taken, his carving tools missing, even his careful improvements to the cabin seeming to mock her with their permanence, while their creator had fled. The note he'd left behind was sparse, as his conversation had been hunting, don't wait to live. But its finality suggested something deeper than temporary absence. His empty corner of the cabin still bearing the scent of wood shavings and the gentle presence that had filled her lonely evenings felt like fresh grave opening in her chest. The bitter irony wasn't lost on her. She'd freed him from one cage only to discover he'd felt trapped in another, bound by gratitude and circumstance rather than genuine choice. Her wedding ring had bought his physical freedom, but emotional freedom required something she couldn't purchase or provide, his own decision that their life together was worth choosing rather than simply enduring. Days stretched into weeks as she maintained the homestead alone, each chore a reminder of shared work, each meal a testament to solitude that felt more profound for having been temporarily relieved. The carved figures he'd made of them sitting together became accusation rather than promise, evidence of dreams that had proved too fragile to survive the weight of reality. Worst was the growing certainty that she'd misunderstood everything, his gestures, his gifts, his apparent contentment. Perhaps his silence hadn't been respectful choice, but protective barrier. His presence hadn't been willing partnership, but careful performance of gratitude. His artistic expressions hadn't been love letters, but polite acknowledgments of temporary sanctuary. As March winds brought hints of spring, and Selma faced the choice between continuing to hope for his return or accepting that their partnership had been illusion. Sustained by her own desperate need for connection, she discovered among his abandoned possessions something that changed her understanding of his departure. A half-finished carving of her face worked with such detailed tenderness that it could only have been created by someone who truly saw and cherished her. The discovery forced her to reconsider his leaving not as abandonment, but as sacrifice, not as rejection, but as gift. The man who'd spent months reading her every mood, anticipating her every need, carving her image with loving precision, would have recognized the growing dependency that was slowly transforming their healing partnership into something that might ultimately harm them both. His note's instruction, "Don't wait to live," took on different meaning when viewed through this lens. He hadn't fled because he didn't love her, but because he loved her enough to refuse to let their relationship become another cage, another form of imprisonment disguised as protection or security. The choice she faced was stark: remain at the homestead, waiting for someone who might never return, or follow his advice and begin living the life he'd given her the courage to claim. The third option, the one that required the most faith, was to trust that if their connection was real, he would find his way back when he was ready to choose her freely, rather than stay from obligation. Standing in the cabin they'd made together, surrounded by evidence of their shared work and wordless communication, Selma realized that loving him meant letting him go completely, even if it meant losing him forever. Only if he returned freely could she trust that their love was real, rather than convenient fiction sustained by mutual loneliness. The morning she found fresh tracks in the mud outside their cabin, Selma's heart caught between hope and disbelief. But the footprints were unmistakably his careful placement, familiar gait, the slight favor of his left side she'd learned to recognize during their months together. He'd returned not to the cabin, but to its vicinity, perhaps watching, perhaps preparing, perhaps gathering courage for approach that might be rejected. When she found him by the creek, carving a new figure in the spring sunlight, their eyes met with understanding that went beyond words. His months away had changed him, leaner, weathered, but carrying himself with confidence that suggested he'd found what he'd gone, seeking the certainty that staying was choice rather than necessity. "I had to know I could leave," he said quietly, his voice rusty from disuse but clear with conviction. "Before I could know I wanted to stay." The wooden hand he placed in hers, empty, waiting to be filled, spoke of readiness for partnership rather than dependence, love rather than gratitude, future rather than mere survival. His return was not surrender, but victory, not the end of his freedom, but the beginning of their genuine choice to be together. But his return was just the beginning. Two people who'd learned they could survive apart now faced the greater challenge of learning to truly live together, building love strong enough to weather any storm. Solon's return brought with it the maturity that had been missing from their first relationship, the understanding that love without choice was obligation, that presence without alternative was imprisonment, and that the deepest intimacy required the freedom to leave before it could become the joy of staying. His months away had taught him that he could survive alone, which gave meaning to his decision to live together. "I carved you everywhere I went," he explained, showing her the collection of small wooden faces he'd created during his journey. "But I needed to know if you were habit or home." The distinction mattered more than either of them had initially understood. Habit meant comfort, routine, mutual aid, all valuable things that could sustain partnership through practical challenges. But home meant choice, renewed daily love that grew stronger through conscious decision rather than convenient circumstance, the rare gift of being truly seen and choosing to remain visible. Their reunion required renegotiation of boundaries, expectations, and dreams that had been interrupted by his absence. The homestead improvements they planned together, expanded garden workshop for his carving additions to accommodate possible future children, reflected commitment based on mutual vision rather than individual need or social convention. The emotional preparation for their true beginning together involved confronting the fundamental question that had driven his departure. Were they together because they were both damaged and alone, or because they genuinely enhanced each other's lives in ways that made partnership preferable to solitude? Selma's months alone had taught her similar lessons about self-sufficiency and choice. She'd discovered she could manage the homestead independently maintain her emotional equilibrium without constant companionship and find satisfaction in work that honored James's memory while building her own future. This knowledge made her decision to welcome Solon back meaningful rather than desperate. "I don't need you," she told him honestly, her words carrying love rather than rejection. "I want you. There's a difference that matters." Their new understanding required different symbols, different rituals, different ways of being together that honored what they'd learned during separation. The rings they would exchange wouldn't replace what had been lost, but would represent what they'd chosen to create partnership built on strength rather than weakness, love that enhanced rather than completed them, commitment that felt like freedom rather than constraint. The tension lay not in whether they would stay together, but in how they would negotiate the balance between individual autonomy and shared life. Their second beginning required rebuilding trust that had been damaged not by betrayal, but by incomplete understanding of what they meant to each other. Solon's art became the bridge between his departure and return, the carved faces that proved he'd carried her memory, the wooden hand that acknowledged her autonomy, the new figures that showed them as equals rather than rescuer and rescued. His willingness to share the full story of his months away, the towns he'd visited, the work he'd found, the moments he'd almost decided not to return, demonstrated commitment to honesty that their first relationship had lacked. Her listening without accusation or demand for justification showed growth in her understanding of love as gift rather than payment for services rendered. The physical intimacy that had been tentative before his departure became confident after his return, based on choice rather than proximity, desire rather than comfort. Their first kiss carried weight of decision rather than impulse. Their first night together was celebration rather than consolation. They were no longer two broken people healing together, but two whole people choosing to share their completeness. The marriage ceremony they planned reflected their unique beginning and unconventional development. Rather than traditional church wedding that might raise questions about Celine's mysterious past, they chose hand fasting conducted by a traveling minister who cared more about their obvious devotion than their social credentials. The legal documents that established Solon's identity used his chosen name and her testimony about his character, creating official existence based on present reality rather than unknown history. Their marriage certificate became not just romantic symbol, but practical protection that would allow him to own property, enter contracts, and exist in territorial society without fear of arbitrary imprisonment. The community they were building included other couples who'd found each other through unconventional means, former soldiers seeking peace, widows creating new families, immigrants establishing American identities. Their acceptance by neighbors who valued character over pedigree provided social foundation for the life they were creating together. Most importantly, their story began inspiring other people trapped in circumstances that seemed hopeless. Women in abusive marriages, men struggling with trauma families, broken by loss or misfortune. They became proof that transformation was possible, that the most damaged beginnings could produce the most beautiful outcomes when supported by patience, choice, and genuine love. The homestead they developed became model for sustainable living that honored both individual skills and collaborative vision. Selma's practical management combined with Solon's artistic sensibility created property that was both beautiful and functional, demonstrating that frontier life could encompass aesthetic values alongside survival necessities. His carved decorations throughout their home told the story of their relationship without words. Figures representing their journey from strangers to partners, natural scenes that captured the beauty they discovered in their isolated location portraits, that showed how he saw her strong, independent, worthy of artistic celebration. The school they established for children in their remote area served families who'd previously had no educational options, while Solon's art instruction provided creative outlet that enriched young lives beyond basic literacy and arithmetic. Their commitment to community service demonstrated that their happiness wasn't selfish retreat from social responsibility, but foundation for contributing to others' welfare. The children they raised grew up understanding that families could be created through choice rather than just blood, that love could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, that the greatest strength came from choosing partnership while maintaining individual identity and capability. The wooden wedding rings Solon carved for their ceremony represented transformation of their story's central symbols. Her gold wedding band had bought his freedom. Their wooden rings celebrated the freedom they'd given each other to choose love rather than accept loneliness, partnership rather than independence, vulnerability rather than protective isolation. The empty ring pouch she'd once tied to their campfire was filled now with tokens of their shared journey, carved animals, pressed flowers, small stones from places they'd traveled together. What had once symbolized loss and abandonment now held evidence of rebuilding and renewal. The final carving he completed, their empty wooden hands joined together, waiting to be filled with whatever life might bring, stood on their mantel as reminder that their love story wasn't finished but ongoing, that each day brought new opportunities to choose each other, and that the deepest intimacy came from facing the future together while remaining complete individuals. Their house became known throughout the territory as a place where damaged people could find healing, where unconventional love could flourish, and where the most beautiful relationships grew from the soil of mutual respect, patient understanding, and the radical courage to be completely known by another human being. The spring that marked their first full year as a married couple brought prosperity that neither could have achieved alone. Their crops flourished under Selma's knowledgeable care and Solon's artistic landscaping, while his carved goods found ready market among families who appreciated both their beauty and the love story behind their creation. More importantly, they'd created life that honored both their individual strengths and their shared vision, proving that the most lasting partnerships are built not on need, but on the choice to create something beautiful together that neither could accomplish alone. But their greatest achievement would be the proof that love could indeed bloom from the most unlikely beginnings when nurtured with patience, watered with trust, and given the freedom to grow into its own unique beauty. Within 3 years of their marriage, the Solon homestead had become a landmark of successful recovery and intentional love that influenced the entire territory. Their story spread through frontier communities as proof that the most damaged beginnings could produce the most beautiful outcomes when supported by genuine choice, patient understanding, and legal protection. Other couples, facing social ostracism for unconventional relationships, found courage in their example, while community leaders began reconsidering assumptions about who deserved respect and recognition regardless of mysterious pasts or unusual circumstances. The legal precedent established by Solon's official recognition using only his chosen name influenced territorial policy toward former prisoners and people seeking fresh starts. Their homestead became sanctuary for other damaged souls seeking healing and renewal, while Solon's art found markets throughout Colorado and beyond, creating economic foundation that supported not just their own prosperity, but employment for other craftspeople and artists in their region. Most importantly, their marriage demonstrated that love based on choice rather than circumstance, understanding rather than passion and mutual respect, rather than traditional roles, could produce lasting happiness and community contribution. The Solon family homestead remained a landmark of successful alternative living for generations, its story inspiring movements toward prison reform, trauma, recovery, and recognition that artistic expression could be valuable therapy for people healing from various forms of damage. Their example influenced territorial policies toward rehabilitation rather than mere punishment. Solon's carved works became prized throughout the American West, his artistic legacy preserving not just aesthetic beauty, but philosophical approach to seeing value in damaged things, finding hope in unlikely circumstances, and creating beauty from whatever materials life provided. His techniques influenced generations of folk artists and craftspeople, their educational innovations teaching practical skills alongside artistic expression, honoring different forms of intelligence, creating inclusive environments for children from various backgrounds, became models for frontier schools throughout the developing West. Their emphasis on seeing potential rather than focusing on limitations influenced pedagogical approaches that helped many struggling students. The legal frameworks established through Solon's case influenced American approaches to identity documentation, prisoner rehabilitation, and the rights of people to reinvent themselves based on present character, rather than past circumstances. Their story became cited in legal cases involving personal autonomy, the validity of chosen identity, and the possibility of genuine transformation. Most significantly, their relationship provided enduring proof that the deepest love often grows from understanding rather than attraction, choice rather than circumstance, and the willingness to see past surface damage to recognize the eternal worth that trauma cannot destroy. Selma's journey from grieving widow to confident partner demonstrated that healing from profound loss was possible when supported by genuine love that honored rather than replaced what had been lost. Her willingness to risk her most precious possession for a stranger's freedom revealed character that attracted exactly the kind of love she deserved. Solon's evolution from silenced prisoner to expressive artist proved that trauma's damage could be transformed into sources of strength and beauty when given safe space to heal and authentic choice about how to rebuild life and identity. Together, they embodied the frontier ideal of reinvention, people who created new identities based on chosen values rather than imposed circumstances or inherited limitations. True love recognizes what words cannot always express, that human worth transcends circumstances, that the deepest connections are built through understanding rather than explanation, and that sometimes the most precious gifts are given not because we can afford them, but because we cannot afford to withhold them. Their legacy endures in every relationship that chooses understanding over explanation, patience over demand, and love over fear. The mountain man who sat silent in a cage became proof that sometimes the most powerful communication happens without words, that the most valuable freedom is the liberty to choose love rather than accept loneliness, and that wedding rings, whether gold or carved wood, symbolize not ownership, but the mutual choice to see and be seen completely. Selma's decision to trade her wedding ring for a stranger's freedom wasn't abandonment of her first love, but fulfillment of everything James had taught her about recognizing worth where others saw only problems. Their story reminds us that the most important purchases aren't made with money, but with the courage to invest our most precious possessions, our trust, our vulnerability, our capacity for hope in people who might prove worthy of such gifts. In the end, they prove that when two people choose to break down the walls that protect them from further hurt, they often discover that what they built together is stronger than anything they'd constructed alone. The cage that was meant to break one man's spirit became the foundation for a love story that celebrated the unbreakable nature of human dignity, the transformative power of genuine choice, and the radical truth that sometimes the most beautiful relationships begin not with passion, but with one person recognizing another's worth and being willing to pay any price to honor it.